Civilian Review Board Work Group. Again, Mo Wright, good to be back with you. I think we've got several of our work group members on, and I know Denise and my team are taking note of all of you. So today's meeting is really going to be all about the roles and responsibilities of our Inspector General. We know that as a part of the Charter Amendment, that was one of the provisions that we are calling for is the establishment of the Inspector General. We're going to do a few things through today's meeting. But just to kind of recap where we are in the process, you'll recall at meeting 2, we spent time really learning all about Civilian Review Board models. Alexa from Baker and Hostetler walked us through a number of models around the country. I think there was 10 cities or so, and you all got some supplemental data from that process. And we're going to continue that learning today, similar format, and looking at Inspector General models also in some of those same cities. And so we'll start the meeting there, but also at the last meeting, we talked a little bit about the local commission model. So Jason walked us through some overview of how we've seen like the commissioner and the Board of Health. We looked at the Recreation and Parks model to look at it as a similarity to probably how the Civilian Review Board will eventually be structured within city government. And so we looked at both of those models in the last meeting. And then, of course, we will always have time toward the end of our meeting to have you to reflect on any additional items that you believe are important to the establishment of a strong Civilian Review Board and related department to come. So good to see everybody back. Glad to be back with you, and we will prepare to jump in here in just a minute. For today's meeting, after these brief kind of editorial remarks, we'll jump right into the Inspector General roles and responsibilities. We have Alexa back with us again, so thank you for rejoining us this meeting. We also will be rejoined by our colleagues in Chicago to get an overview of particularly Chicago Police Board's investigative powers, and we're going to treat that more as a Q&A. Geon Foreman is with us today, and he'll be available during that time to answer questions about kind of the mechanics of how the investigative process works and how it relates to both the Chicago Police Board, which would be analogous to our Civilian Review Board that is to come. And then, as I said, we'll end out our meeting with our facilitated discussion as we do every meeting to allow you time to we want to get the structure of the department and of the Inspector General established and bring forth a final recommendation around about meeting number 6 to be able for you to formally endorse. So we are continuing to gather feedback, as you know, along the way for this process. So it's been good to see everybody, and thank you again for being here. I will then consider everybody welcome. We do have some additional guests today. We get some representatives from our local firm at Jones Day, who've been helping to advise the city and make some connections to the Chicago group. So welcome to that team from Jones Day. And then, of course, there are a number of you from the work group as well. So we won't do introductions round robin, but good to see your faces or at least your screens at this point. Just a reminder, as we do every meeting, keeping in mind this is a public meeting. It is being both streamed and recorded. I will remind work group members that we want to refrain from using the chat feature only because it is not also live streamed, and we do need to keep things in the public. So if you would only use the chat feature for technical type requests, can't hear something or something like that, we would appreciate making sure all the other comments are done verbally so we can ensure a proper public record. So I want to make sure we adhere to that standard as a part of our open meetings law as well. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and give both the mic and the screen over to Alexa, who is going to walk us through just a model of some of the other Civilian Review Boards, and particularly the Inspector General, I should say, around the country, and then she's going to overview quite a bit of that information and take some questions around some of the research that she and her firm have been doing. So, Alexa.
Thank you, Mel. Hi, everyone. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak with you again today. And I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, Mo, can you see that fine?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So as Mo mentioned, I'll be talking about the Inspector General's roles and responsibilities, and then we'll also cover staffing and budgeting for both the CRB and the Office of Inspector General. So an overview of the topics today, we're going to talk about the Inspector General's powers and duties, and then we're going to go through 5 cities that have some type of Office of Inspector General, and we'll talk about those functions and how they relate to the Civilian Review Board's functions. And then we'll also talk about staffing, budgeting, and funding, and we'll go through each city and see how they go about doing that. So the Inspector General's role is auditor or monitor focused. You might see this called the Office of the Independent Police Monitor or the Independent Auditor. Goes by several different names, but usually has similar functions. The Inspector General acts as the eyes and ears of the Civilian Review Board. So it gathers information for the CRB. But this can take a lot of different approaches depending on the city. The OIG can independently investigate or review investigations that are conducted by the police department and then make recommendations either to the CRB or directly to the police chief or the police department. The Inspector General also reviews policies and procedures and issues recommendations and has a key public reporting function. And then you'll see in some of these examples that in some cities, the OIG will take on some of the functions that are traditionally reserved to CRBs, like community outreach. I think based on how the charter looks, that's probably not what you're thinking here, and you'll probably have that function be in the CRB, but I wanted to give you some examples. It's important that the Inspector General has unfettered access to documents and cooperation of the police department, as well as direct access to the police chief. The staff of the Inspector General's office tend to become police experts, have large budgets, and have extensive training. And there is some evidence that the OIG model is more effective at promoting long-term systemic change. So that might be a reason why City Council and other people at the city wanted to put this model into the amendment. So some considerations that we'll go through today. Whether investigations are done by the CRB or the OIG, you're going to need a full-time professional and clerical staff. And some of this will depend on the size of the city and then also the size of the police department. And we'll go through that with some of these 5 cities as examples. And you'll want to think about what roles are necessary to accomplish the mission of the Inspector General's office, qualifications for those roles, and then how we can get qualified applicants to apply. So we'll start off with Los Angeles. And just a reminder, because we talked about Los Angeles last time, the Board of Police Commissioners is their version of the CRB. And that is the group that investigates individual officer misconduct, whereas the Office of the Inspector General focuses on systemic issues. And this is what you'll typically find in most cities that have an Inspector General's office, which I was a little surprised by that when I began researching this, because to me, Inspector General sounds like a group that would be doing more investigations of independent misconduct, but that's usually not the case. So an example in Los Angeles, the OIG will get involved if there's an officer-involved shooting or significant use of force. And the way this works, getting down to the details, is that first, the supervisor on the scene, who is in the police department, will identify the shooter and separate the officers. Then within 2 hours, a representative from the OIG will respond and have full access to the scene. And that person will monitor the investigation. But the investigation is still conducted by people within the police department, like criminalists and detectives from the Force Investigation Division. And some of those are civilian staff members, but they're still within the police department. And then the OIG will stay in touch with the detectives throughout the investigation. At the 30-day mark, the detectives meet with the Assistant Inspector General for a briefing. And at that point, the assistant can tell them to go back and do more investigating or certify that you can go through the next steps. And once the investigation report is completed by the police department, then the OIG will annotate that report, write down whether more questions need to be answered or more witness interviews need to occur. And then there will be an administrative hearing with the police commission. The chief will prepare a report and recommendation, and the police commission will make 3 findings regarding the officer's tactics, the reasonableness of drawing a weapon, and whether the use of force was within or outside of policy. So this provides a good example of how the Inspector General's office can work with the Civilian Review Board. Then to give you a little bit of an idea of how this type of Inspector General's office will be funded, you can see that the population of LA is around 4 million, and the number of sworn officers is 10,000, which is obviously a lot larger than here. But their staff has 55 civilians. Some of the education that they have can be JD, Masters, Certified Law Enforcement, and you'll see a lot of different requirements for the cities. And the way that their group is composed, there's obviously the Inspector General, there's 3 assistants for 3 different groups: complaint, audit, and use of force. And then there's 16 investigators, 6 auditors, a couple community outreach specialists, which you mentioned you may not need that, 22 policy analysts, an IT manager, an office manager, and 3 administrative assistants. And in order to fund a staff of that size, at least out in California, their budget is $6 million. And then to give you a feel about the requirements or qualifications you might want for some of these staff positions, in LA, the Assistant Inspector General is still appointed rather than just going through a normal application process. And it requires a bachelor's and 5 years of professional experience as an attorney or supervising complex law enforcement investigations. Applicants can submit a letter of interest, resume, salary history, and 5 references. And after a screening, there's a writing exercise. And you'll see that a lot of these Inspector General offices will require some type of writing or essay. And I think that's a way to distinguish applicants. And we don't need to get into too many of the details of these qualifications, but I just wanted to provide some examples here of the police performance auditor. Sometimes it may require a bachelor's degree. Other times, cities will allow for some type of experience that gives you just the same qualifications. Most of them have an online application process, and as I mentioned before, essays. And then you may want to consider background checks or other ways to screen candidates because you might get a lot of applications. And that's just a reminder that the actual CRB, the Board of Commissioners, is volunteer-based. So that's why the Inspector General's office in LA is so large. And that might not necessarily be what you do in Columbus if your Civilian Review Board is stronger. So moving on to New York, and I wanted to mention I'm not going to talk too much about Chicago today since you all will have the expert here and you can ask him questions. But with New York, the Office of the Inspector General is actually a part of the city's Department of Investigations. And so that is a watchdog for most of the city's departments, not just the police force. But the Inspector General is focused on the police. And as with LA, the CCRB conducts investigations into individual officer misconduct, while the OIG focuses on patterns of misconduct. And so sometimes the Inspector General will refer individual complaints to the CCRB. And the police commissioner will have 90 days to respond to the findings of the Inspector General's report and recommendations. And those recommendations will relate more to tactics or overall policies that need change. So I found this on New York's OIG website to show you the org chart and think about ways that you could organize the group. As we know, New York City is huge, has a population of 8 million, and it has over 38,000 sworn officers. So that is pretty different from here. But the OIG there has 40 employees, and similar to a lot of other cities, there are investigators, attorneys, policy analysts, auditors, and administrative employees for an overall budget of $7 million. And I know last time there was a question about attorneys. And so from the research I did, it looks like the attorneys are usually providing more of an advice and counsel role. And I think we talked about how maybe here the city attorney's office would need to be involved for counseling purposes. And these are just some more examples of requirements you could have for some of these positions. You'll see New York here allows for an equivalent of certain degrees if the person has the right type of experience, for example, working for a government agency, conducting investigations, working in security, things like that. And then I wanted to show you how New York, as opposed to LA, actually has a really large CCRB. So you can see why their Inspector General's office is not necessarily huge for the size of the city. And the CCRB has 160 or so staff members, including 26 deputy directors and 110 investigators. So that is very robust. And their investigators are conducting the actual investigations into individual officer misconduct. I did find that the average salary is around $88,000 for those members or those employees. That can vary widely between deputy directors and administrative assistants. But the overall budget for New York CCRB is $16 million. So now we're going to talk about a few cities that we have not yet covered. I know we talked about LA and New York last week, but I thought that these had pretty good models of what the Inspector General can do. So we're going to start with Seattle. Seattle's OIG has 3 functions: to audit and systemically review the Seattle Police Department, and then also the Office of Police Accountability. And the Office of Police Accountability is basically the CRB for Seattle. The OIG reviews the OPA's complaint handling and how investigations are conducted by OPA staff, and also works with SPD and partners to improve policies and practices. So you'll see that OPA, the CRB, handles complaints against individual officers, while the OIG focuses on systematic change. And diving into the details, OPA is responsible for classifying complaints into those that require full investigations and those that can just be handled by a supervisor within the police department internally. And the Inspector General's office will ensure that that classification occurs the way that it should. And then once the OPA completes an investigation, the OIG certifies whether that investigation was objective, thorough, and timely. So again, they're not looking at discipline recommendations. The OIG is focused more on that, whether the investigation process was fair. And then the OPA director will issue a certification memo with findings and recommendations to the police chief about whether the discipline is appropriate. And so that's how these two groups collaborate in Seattle. Another important aspect is that if a complaint presents a conflict of interest for the OPA, then the Inspector General will handle that investigation and issue findings and recommendations. So that can be an important aspect of having an Inspector General's office. And this is a map that I pulled from their site. It can show you how the disciplinary process works, and it's fairly complex. But if you see kind of the second level, on the far left, some of the complaints will just go to the contact log, which basically means that the allegation either doesn't support a policy violation on its face, or there's just not enough evidence to take it anywhere. Some will go through an expedited investigation, and that is if the violation is serious, but it's so obvious that a violation occurred that you can conduct a quicker investigation that may not need to interview witnesses. More minor policy violations can be reviewed by the police department, and that's where it says supervisor action. Then there's a mediation process and a criminal referral process. And then the most standard is the administrative investigation. And that's where you get OPA a little bit more involved. And as you see, if you go down near the bottom, something that's important to note here is that Seattle has still kept the arbitration process. So even though the Civilian Review Board, or OPA, is involved in discipline at some level, you still keep that arbitration process. And this might be something to talk about next time you meet with Jenny Edwards when she talks about, I believe Jenny's talking to you all, when she talks about collective bargaining, is if you can maintain that arbitration process, it might be a good way to ensure that you can accomplish a lot of your goals. And then looking at staffing.
I'm sorry, real quick, Alexa. I don't understand what you're referring to when you say, so we would have a say in the collective bargaining process? Is that?
Oh, I can explain a little further. So when you all design how you want the Inspector General's office and the Civilian Review Board to look, eventually the city will need to bargain to actually make the CRB and the OIG look the way we want it to look. And to the extent that you don't have to make as many collective bargaining changes, the more likely you are to accomplish your goals. So basically, she'll talk to you in a little bit more detail about what's actually in the collective bargaining agreement and what things will need to be changed in order to accomplish these goals, but that's something to keep in mind. So moving to staffing and budgeting, the population of Seattle is a little bit smaller than Columbus, with around 745,000. And then the sworn officers is slightly lower. And they just have 9 OIG staff members. And you see a lot of the same roles that you see for some of the other OIGs. And that budget is about $1.4 million. And that's another example for the Seattle Public Safety Auditor for the Inspector General's office. You can apply on LinkedIn, and they also allow relevant work experience to substitute for a degree. Then I wanted to show you the org chart for OPA. So you can see there's a director, and there's a public affairs section, and that has more your analysts and community engagement roles, which might not be something that you need for Columbus, but you'll definitely want the investigation section. And for OPA, they have sworn investigators, and then a couple civilian investigators. So the sworn investigators are police department members. And then they have the operations side that is handling more of the clerical and administrative side of things. And that budget is $3.6 million. So we're also going to talk about New Orleans. They call their group the Independent Police Monitor, and they actually don't have a CRB. And so that's why their group might take on a few of the roles that you would traditionally see with the CRB. So New Orleans Police Department's Public Integrity Bureau is basically internal affairs and investigates complaints. The police monitor enters the scene by reviewing how the PIB classifies the complaints and then reviewing the final investigation for fairness, thoroughness, and timeliness, and then issuing a report. And for uses of force, the OIG has a special role. It will identify civil rights violations, tactical concerns, and policy issues, and then issue an annual report on timeliness and the quality of investigations. And as you can see, the New Orleans Police Department does have a fairly complex complaint procedure. You can see that there are 3 points of intake for complaints, and I know we talked about this a little bit last time because you want to make sure that civilians have a lot of different opportunities to make their complaints and a lot of different avenues for that. So there are designated community agencies that can receive some of the complaints. Of course, the PIV or internal affairs can, and then the independent police monitor's office can also receive them. And IPM will track these complaints to identify areas of concern with maybe tactics or policies and procedures that need to change and make those recommendations to the police department. Also, the police department has an early warning system to identify officers that are repeatedly engaging in misconduct and try to get out ahead of those concerns. And I think I remember reading somewhere that Columbus has something similar, but I could be wrong about that. But that's something to think about. And in New Orleans, the independent police monitor will monitor the effectiveness of that system in identifying officers that repeatedly engage in misconduct. And then for your typical complaints, IA will classify them into criminal or administrative. The monitor will review that. And then once the investigation occurs, there could be an administrative hearing, and then IPM or the independent police monitor will review the disciplinary action for whether it was appropriate or not. And so that's a role that you see traditionally reserved to the CRB. But here, because there is only an independent police monitor, the IPM does that. And you can see the stats here. The population of New Orleans is around 391,000. Now, I know that's not entirely accurate because there are a lot of tourists, more than there would be in Columbus. So there may be more people in the area, which may explain why the number of sworn officers is still fairly high. But there are only 9 paid staff members in the independent police monitor's office. And you can see their budget is around $1 million. But they do employ the help of local pro bono attorneys, student law clerks, and interns. So that might be a way to think about cost savings. And then again, these are some of the qualifications that New Orleans requires for staff members of the independent police monitor's office. And as you can see, professional experience can often substitute for particular degrees, and they require a written exam, background check, drug test, and special work history form. And then something that's a little different here is that there's a probationary period for staff members where they have to obtain a certificate of evaluation practice to make sure that they are up to speed on everything. And then our last city is Denver, which they also call their office the independent monitor. And the independent monitor monitors and participates in critical incident investigations. And these can be officer-involved shootings, in custody deaths, uses of force that involve great bodily injury or death. And the way this works is that deputies will sit in on the internal affairs interviews with the excessive force victims and witnesses and suggest questions. But they cannot participate in the interviews of officers. And the independent monitor makes recommendations to the manager of safety, the chief of police, and the director of corrections regarding discipline, and also makes recommendations regarding broader policy and procedural or tactical issues. And then something that's a little bit different is that the independent monitor here will monitor who receives assignments in internal affairs investigations to make sure that the right people are handling those investigations. They also ensure the citizen complaint process is accessible to the community. And then Denver does also have a CRB. They call it the Citizen Oversight Board. And that the COB assesses the effectiveness of the monitor's office. So they're in charge of the independent monitor. They make recommendations regarding discipline, use of force, and other policies, and make recommendations as to closed internal affairs in cases where findings were not sustained. And then you can see here how the complaint process works. It could be received by Internal Affairs or by the independent monitor. And Internal Affairs actually conducts the investigation, with the monitor reviewing the investigation and signing off on whether it's concluded or whether IA needs to do a further investigation. And then the Conduct Review Office that issues the review and recommendation is actually a part of the police department. But the independent monitor will review that recommendation. And then the chief's meeting occurs, the chief issues a recommendation, and then the executive director of safety has an independent review. And the final order of discipline comes from him or her. So that would be similar to our public safety director. And then you can ignore the appeal process on the right, since that's different and particular to Denver. So for staffing, budgeting, and funding, the population of Denver is around 620,000 or so, with about 1,500 sworn officers. And they have a total of 20 staff members. And you see many of the same roles. Although you do also see some youth outreach managers and coordinators. And I know that came up last time as something you might want as part of the CRB. So there's an example in Denver of that. And the budget is about $1.6 million. And then the civilian oversight board there is volunteer-based. So now we'll talk a little bit about what functions each of the roles has, and then some common salaries that you'll see, or some ranges as you think about funding. So the inspector general roles, these were just recent job descriptions that I was able to find for particular cities. And you'll see a range from about $85,000 to $165,000 for the actual inspector general. And then for deputy or assistant inspector generals, you see a range that is fairly similar. And the way these roles work is the inspector general really has more of a managerial role over employees rather than getting very involved in actually reviewing complaints, unless they are, high-profile ones. And so the work is mostly planning, assigning, organizing, and directing the work of the professional and clerical staff. And a lot of times the deputies and assistants will also take on that managerial role. But they will get a little bit more involved in analyzing use of force and citizen complaint investigations, auditing the police department, and making presentations to the CRB. The investigators, as you can probably guess, will, analyze police operations, prepare reports, interview witnesses, canvass the scene, and issue recommendations. And the range of salaries you'll see there can be from $49,000 to, I think the highest looks to be about $195,000. But that includes sometimes investigation managers as well. And the evidence specialist role can be similar to the investigator role. And the analyst and auditor roles are fairly similar. Analysts will review selected operations, policies, programs, and they'll work with the investigative unit of the police department to identify areas of concern and recommend improvements. And so a lot of times people in that role will have a background maybe in social work or policy work. And auditors will analyze police practices, participate in risk management reviews and performance audits, and assist with establishment of protocols and policies for the Inspector General's office. And then you can see the range of salaries for these positions from around $43,000 to up to $128,000 or so. So that's everything that I had for you all today. I'll keep my screen up for questions in case we need to go back to any slides, but I'll hand it over to Mo now.
Thanks, Alexa. A lot of great information. So I'm sure the group has questions. I'm going to kick off with a couple as well. And then, so just for the group, I am going to shift the agenda a bit. I do want to hear from Mr. Foreman first out of Chicago, because I think the conversations are connected, and then we'll bring it back to looking at recommendations for our model in Columbus for the Inspector General. And so, Alexa, just as a follow-up to what you said, one of your early slides had, in terms of the role of the IG, they tend to be police experts, and I didn't know if that was speaking to the fact that they become so entrenched in police work that that's how it happens, or that were you suggesting that those roles typically are occupied by either law enforcement who've been previously on the force or something like that? Can you clarify what you meant by that?
Yes, what I meant was the first one, that they tend to become police experts because they get so far into the nitty-gritty details and learn police directives and tactics and things like that. But they don't necessarily need to be former law enforcement or current law enforcement.
Gotcha. And then has any of your research turned up any sense of the volume of complaints that each of these cities are dealing with, to give us some sense of what an Inspector General might review on an annual basis or monthly basis?
I don't know that I remember any specific numbers. I know it varies pretty widely because some of these boards or inspector general offices will only review really limited types of complaints. So, for example, if it's officer-involved shootings, there may not be that many. But if it's all citizen complaints, there will be a lot. So I don't know that I could give you a number, but I think it might be in that spreadsheet that Matt sent around. I think that figure might be there.
Thank you. Questions from the work group? Make sure you unmute.
Hi, this is Jasmine. Thank you for this presentation. I appreciate it. Just to note for the group, I'll go back and look at my own, but I liked the Seattle flowchart. I thought that when you described it, it made the most sense of all of the arrows and things we had sort of been going through.
Okay.
My other, yes, that I like this. So if we could just like flag that for later, that would be great. I am wondering sort of what are the results of the Inspector General's office and sort of what metrics are they being measured by? And does anyone ever go to jail as a result of their investigations?
I think in some cities, yes, when the OIG gets involved in individual officer misconduct investigations. So, for example, if there were a conflict of interest for the CRB, then the Inspector General would conduct the investigation and issue recommendations. I did not see any examples where the Inspector General's office could fully implement discipline, like stronger than a recommendation. But certainly the recommendation can have an effect and an influence on the chief of police or police commissioner, whoever it might be. As far as metrics, I don't know that I can speak to any specifics. I know that a lot of the Inspector General offices will issue their reports on certain policies that need to change. For example, something like no-knock raids. So to the extent that those policies are changed, there certainly would be an effect. But I don't know that I can speak overall to what major changes have occurred. I think a lot of the changes are more indirect and maybe difficult to measure.
Thanks. Have you come across any cases in all of your research where everything went right? The person made the complaint, the investigation was had, the police department agreed, the officer was fired, everybody was happy.
So I don't know that I've looked at like a specific, one specific citizen complaint to see how it occurred. So I don't know. Maybe could you elaborate a little bit more?
I just mean like, where has there been a case, in what city, and what type of civilian review board, in what fashion that it is built, that it has like cases where someone like everything goes smoothly. It's very rare that the police department is actually going to agree with anything that the CRB or the Inspector General says. But have there been any cases where the process runs flawlessly?
I know that I can speak to that a little bit later when we talk Chicago specifically. I would say, just in my experience, most of the cases it operates really smoothly. It's the really complex cases where it starts to get really complex, just in my experience in Chicago.
Yeah, I think you can probably speak to that better than I can. But it might be something to look into that I could conduct further research on, what model has encountered the least impediments into actually implementing change.
Other questions? Okay. All right, so we will come back to the discussion around the Columbus pieces of this in just a moment. We do want to welcome our second guest today, to Geon Foreman from Chicago, who's the president of the Chicago Police Board. We really have him here as a resource for the group to kind of see how this works in real time and how, and may answer some of your questions about how they have handled certain situations or cases in the city of Chicago. So let me turn the phone over to him for an introduction. I will get your the one slide you have up on the screen here in just a second, and then we will, after some introductory comments from you, be open to, I think you're open to more Q&A format from the work group. So good afternoon again. Make sure you're unmuted. I see you waving. I cannot hear you.
He needed to reconnect.
Okay, let's give him a second. Heard you fine earlier, can't hear you now.
I sent him a note. I think he's trying to figure it out. He's going to log back in.
He said log back in. Okay. All right, we'll give him a second in which to do that. Making sure there are any questions additional for Alexa while we're waiting for that, or any general discussion on what we've heard thus far before we look at kind of the practical example in Chicago.
Hey, y'all, I got more to say, of course. So I just would like us to keep in mind that, like, the first rule of negotiating is you don't go with what you're going to settle for, you go with what you really want. And so I hope that as we're crafting this, we keep in mind that we're going to the table with what we really want, and let's not water it down before we even have an opportunity to have a conversation with people about it.
Okay. Noted.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. There you go.
I apologize. So see, sometimes technology is very similar to what you guys are going to deal with in terms of police community relationships, right? There's a lot that we could plan out, but sometimes technology or something happens, it gets in the way, and we have to make a little bit of a pivot. So my name is Geon Foreman. I'm the president of the Chicago Police Board. I've served on the board now for 10 years. I don't exactly know the timing, but I became the vice president maybe about 5 years ago. I became the vice president. Then she was just Lori Lightfoot. She was the president when she left to run for mayor. Then I became the president of the board. I'm not a lawyer. I work in a nonprofit. I'm the president and CEO of an economic development agency on the south side of the city. I grew up in Chicago public school kid. Just how did I get on the police board? I was doing some work at a local high school, and Mayor Daley at the time heard about some of the work that I was doing, thought it was impactful, and asked me. I was 35 years old at the time. Like, man, we want you to serve on the police board. I'm like, why would I want to have anything to do with it? Like, give me a good reason why. They explained to me what the police board does and role we could have city. So I took on the
Hey,
responsibility.
Denise, can you mute everyone else, please? I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. So I took that responsibility on and just kind of made it a point to just every time we had an issue in front of us, a case, just to really try to take it very seriously. Our police board is made up of 9 individuals. All we're independent of the mayor, independent of the police department, and we have 3 primary tasks. The primary task, the first one that we deal with the most is we deal with the most serious disciplinary cases. So anything for a recommendation from 30 days suspension all the way up to termination, those are the cases that come before the police board. So there was a question earlier about the cases that kind of go through the process. Does it go through smooth and flawlessly? There's a whole portion of a lot of cases that go through just very smoothly, right? So I'll talk about this screen a little bit. That's the majority. Only the hardest of the hardest cases actually come all the way through us. So everything else, a lot of times, is handled before it gets to the police board level. There are 2 different ways that cases can. Oh wait, I'm sorry. So one, we deal with disciplinary cases. Those disciplinary cases can come from one of 2 directions. One direction is IAD, or Internal Affairs. The other one is COPA, and the COPA stands for Civilian Office of Police Accountability. So to me, it kind of seems like your OIG is kind of a hybrid of our COPA and police board. So I'll kind of describe those 2. And generally speaking, I would say that if it comes from CPD, Internal Affairs, it's like they broke an internal rule, something relating to with the police department. You were late for work or insubordination or something like that. COPA is typically going to be if you broke a rule as it related to a member of the public. So it could be excessive force, it could be your language, it could be theft if you stole something from a store. And so COPA would investigate. So it's a little bit of a difference in terms of how they would. So here, this is just a little flow chart in terms of how it goes. A complaint is made. Once it's determined which path that complaint goes, it either goes to COPA, CPD, or our Inspector General. Inspector General is like really oversight kind of over all of us, really doesn't get involved too much in the day-to-day kind of situations, but definitely helpful in terms of helping us think about the bigger picture as well, I would say. And so once there's an investigation done, it could be either by IAD or COPA. It's either a couple of choices. It's sustained, not sustained, exonerated, or unfounded. If it's found sustained, and I'm just going to just make this kind of general. If it's sustained, then the recommendation is made. It comes to the police board. We have a hearing, and then I'll do that. But I'll come back to this a little bit later. There's another situation where COPA and the superintendent disagree. So what happens when there's a disagreement case? They have to speak with each other. They have to try to see if they can work it out to come to an agreement. If they can come to an agreement, then great, they have an agreement. If they don't, the police board has to kind of be the tiebreaker to say, should this case go forward and get a full hearing or not? So I say that because as I saw those flow charts, I think that those flow charts that you saw, it's critical. Really important that you understand those processes, just like we have here. Really kind of simplified this to make sure that it was something that could really be understood. But I think it's also very important that you have times associated with those and mandatory communication points. So let's make the assumption that the case now comes to the police board. We then have to review the hearing. In our case, we watch We have to read the transcripts, watch the videos of it. We get together as a board, the 9 of us, we go over the information. The hearing officer presents the info. They're there as a presenter, what happened in the case. And we discuss it when we ultimately make our decision. It's important when we make our decision that we write it up just as if it were, I'm not a lawyer, right? So in my plain language, I'm going to say we have to write it up the same way we would write up a court case. Typically, our lawyers, our hearing officers are lawyers. We have our general counsel. So they will review it to make sure, did we cover all of the points that we thought we should have? Because that officer, ultimately, the officer or CPD, the superintendent, has the right to appeal our decision. Do our decisions get appealed? All the time. Are our decisions overturned? Sometimes, not the majority of the time. So it requires us to kind of look at each part of the process, understand the process from start to finish, and really kind of make sure that we efficiently get through the process. So efficiently is another part. The second thing that we do is we have the ability that when there is an opening in the position of the superintendent, it's our responsibility to advertise for that, to interview, kind of see what we need, and ultimately make our recommendations to the mayor for 3 candidates. The mayor is mandated to choose from one of our 3, or they could send us back to the drawing board and we would have to start over and go get another 3 candidates. The third thing that we have is we have policy we have the ability to recommend policy. Now, this is a tough one. This is a really tough one. The policies that we're talking about is like high-level constitution-like policies, not individual day-to-day policies. So, the issue we're talking about now that everyone is facing is chokeholds. This is one of the places where we have to go with our counsel. We have to read what the state statute says, what the city ordinance says. Do we really have the ability to make the recommendation for policy that is a very specific police related? So we're not really necessarily clear on that answer yet. This is some of the things that you all will have to kind of think through as you get through this. And again, a part of it is what access to experts do you have? I work in economic development. I couldn't really tell you what it's like to try to, put someone in handcuffs or something like that. And so it's important that you have those experts that can also help you kind of identify those situations. So we work very closely. Communication is very important. So we work very closely with our IG, with COPA, with the superintendent's office, with our law department. Law is kind of one of those things. Don't forget about the law department because they are at least in our situations, they can be, everything kind of has to pass through them. So, and then now we have the consent decree, so the federal monitor as well. So one thing that I found that's been very helpful in going through this consent decree process is we have some standard meeting times, right? So we have bi-weekly meetings with some of those groups. We have quarterly meetings with some of those other groups. So everyone kind of knows what everyone is working on. Good communication going back and forth. And I don't have any more slides, so you could take this down. But and I think that it also forces us to try to keep everyone accountable. If you have a certain number of days you have to get through this process, where are you in this process, right? And so one thing that I would really encourage, you have a university there, you have big companies there about design thinking. So think about the process from start to finish and make sure that you're utilizing technology to make sure that the processes, that nothing slips through the cracks. It was pretty widely advertised that during the uprisings here in the city, I was struck by a police officer that weekend with a baton. And I didn't really want to make a complaint, but I had to make a complaint. And so now I'm actually, for the first time, going through this process, right? From start to finish. I was hit. I had to make a complaint. I had to call. And I can tell you, it's a scary process. It's you don't really want to go through it. Where you kind of feel like, man, are they trying to insinuate that I did something? So I think that it's very important to make sure that the entire process really gets designed, and it's designed not so much to be punitive, although that may be the outcome, but it's designed to improve your overall system. And so that's kind of the general thing that I would say, but certainly open to questions. I've seen a lot, done a lot, seen administrations pile things on top of each other to try to fix one situation and end up being a Dagwood sandwich where you put too many ingredients on a sandwich and it was no longer edible. So I've also seen where simplicity sometimes is a much better solution.
So thank you, Mr. Foreman, for that, and I'll open up to the group for questions. I guess I'll kick off with one, which is, you've seen a lot from both, obviously, the PRB, but as well as COPA. We have the luxury of learning from you in terms of what you guys have been doing. What would you redesign about the Chicago system, or what would you have us think really critically about as we kind of design both our CRB, which would be an equivalent to your COPA, or this Inspector General for I said that backwards, the Police Review Board being this Inspector General body. In either case, what would you have us probably think about really being thoughtful around as we go through this process?
I think efficiency. We have cases that are 4 and 5 years old, 6, 7 years old. I don't think that's fair to anyone. It's not fair to the police officer who's been accused, whether if they're guilty or innocent, and it's not fair to the person who's making the accusation, whether or not it's true or not, right? 6, 7 years go by, man, I'm ready to move on with my life. Nothing has happened. It doesn't seem that you guys really care. It doesn't seem like anything is going to change. And so a big part of it is that if you want buy-in from the public, you have to move efficiently, right? And it's something that we're seeing in the news. The public has a hard time understanding why you can come after me so quickly if I do something, but it takes forever to go after the police. One way that I think that it makes sense, because these are tough cases too, right? There was a comment earlier about, when it's an open and shut case. Tell the truth, there are not so many open and shut cases. There are some, and obviously we see a lot of the open shut cases, they're bigger, but there are a lot of cases where it's a lot of gray. I think utilizing technology to help with that efficiency is important. Each one of us on our birthdays, we get some kind of email. Happy birthday. You come show us code, you get a free coffee, right? Why don't we do the same thing? If 7 days have gone by and there's no update to this file, there should be some kind of requirement. What are you doing? What's the next steps? Where are we in the process? And, Booz and McKinsey and all of these companies that we pay a lot of money to figure things out, they have some design process learning, or Ohio State. They have some design process learning that we can integrate into this that gives everyone a sense of checks and balances in terms of how do you keep the process moving forward in an efficient way.
That's good. That's good. Questions from my colleagues on the work group for Mr. Foreman.
Yes, I had a question for Mr. Foreman. Hey, Mr. Foreman, thank you for that presentation. And I'm sorry that you had to, experience that with that officer with the baton. But I wanted to ask you about just, the intake process that you had to go through to start the complaint. I know that you had touched on the importance of having, a streamlined process that's easy, that folks feel comfortable going through. And a lot of folks I know deal with, police brutality and often don't file a complaint because they either don't know how the process goes or it just gets too complicated. So I kind of wanted to take, without getting into too much detail in your specific case, just kind of what you dealt with the intake process. Was there a form that you filled out, questions that you had to, answer? Was there a follow-up interview potentially? Just kind of what that process was.
So now I'm gonna keep it real with you. I know this is a public meeting. I didn't want to file a complaint. The mayor made me file a complaint. I really wanted to go to the training academy and get in the boxing ring with the guy. I really did not want to file a complaint. And frankly, I didn't want to file a complaint because it was a bad situation for everybody. Everybody lost that day. The public lost, the police lost. I was out taking a walk, man, and walked into a protest. I got beat by my wife much worse than what happened for walking into the protest. So the mayor forced me to. So I didn't call the regular telephone number. I called the chief of COPA and said, hey, I need to file a complaint. And then someone called me. But basically, the process was the same, right? I talked to COPA. I had to talk to COPA on the phone, one person. She had to call me back with somebody else on the phone. Asked me some of the same questions again. Maybe that person asked another couple of questions. All right, thanks. They hung up. They called me back a little bit later, asked me a couple of questions. I'm trying to remember what happened. A week later, somebody else calls me. A week later, I kind of don't remember some of the details. I had to kind of go back. And then this was, of course, this was a bigger deal. So I had to talk to, the federal monitor. I actually had to go talk to, they're looking at potential criminal charges. And so, it was a scary, scary process. I didn't hear anything, 6 weeks later or whatever it is, I get something in the mail. Hey, we processed your thing. We're working on it. A couple of weeks later, I get a call from from one of my people, a doctor who saw me, like, hey, they've asked me. And so it kind of seems like to the individual who doesn't know the process, this is a never ending process. It feels hard, right? And so if there was some way that I could know how my process was improving, that something was actually going to get through, maybe it makes me feel okay. Maybe even if I understood what the process is, what is the expected timeline? I think communication is going to be so key to whatever you guys are doing. One thing that I generally have learned is that it's just like with your kids. Sometimes you can absolutely tell when your kid is lying. And sometimes it's a matter of perception, what they thought they did, right? Is it a function of training? If this person is poorly trained, can we blame this person for the actions that they did? And so that's what I mean about these are really, really a lot of gray areas, and it's just not as, especially now, you guys will be faced with things like police officer A did something and police officer B filled out paperwork. Is one sin worse than another sin? So there are things like that it's just not as kind of straightforward. And until you are faced with something, hard to kind of say. I'll tell you, I found the presentation that we just saw very helpful for me. I saw things that I was like, oh man, we can improve our process if we did something like that. So I think you guys are absolutely doing the right thing by having these conversations. And frankly, I've never been a part of these conversations before this year. Maybe I had a little bit during the LaQuan McDonald times, but right now I've spoken with New York, speaking with you guys. Jones Day has been incredible, introducing us to people in Minnesota. And so, I think this is going to be an iterative process for us to continuously learn from each other and kind of continuously improve the process.
Yeah. Other questions from the work group?
I have a question, if I can.
Go ahead.
Mr. Foreman, this is Fred Benton. Thank you for your presentation. Have you had circumstances in which there have been parallel proceedings, either in terms of a civil lawsuit or criminal proceeding relating to the complaint that was submitted to your organization? And if so, the documents and the information that your group gathers, is that then subject to disclosure for the other proceedings?
Yeah.
In other words, if I'm involved in a civil lawsuit or I'm involved in a criminal proceedings, can I request those documents or make a public record request or subpoena those documents for purposes of those other matters?
Yeah, let me see. Bethany, is Bethany on the call? Let me see. So this is the place where I need a lawyer. So some lawyer is going to be able to help me though. All right. So there's this one, as it relates to police, there's a case, you know how the Supreme Court has cases, like a precedent cases. And so there's one case where, police officer, but this is a general rule, but police officer, at least in Chicago, maybe it's not everywhere, because of the way the union rules, they can't refuse to answer a question to their superior officers. So if your superior officer says, hey, did you shoot that person, whatever. If you answer that, none of that information can be used in the criminal trial because they were compelled to testify. Garrity, yeah, somebody just said that. Garrity is, you got to look this thing up. It's a rule called Garrity. And so this is exactly what we faced when it came to the case with LaQuan McDonald. So this is when Mayor Lightfoot was the president and I was the board vice president. So much pressure from the city to say, fire these guys right now. So they filed the case with us, fire these guys right now. So now what are we to do? If we move forward and we go forward with our hearing and we try to, you know, not necessarily fire because we ultimately have to decide, but we have the case. None of that information that's held in that hearing can be used in a criminal case. So now you jeopardize potentially the criminal case. So this is something that I don't care what the process looks like. You're not going to be able to satisfactorily satisfy the public about that, right?
Okay, but I'm familiar with Garrity, but if you have, for example, witness interviews, photographs, physical evidence, is that information retained exclusively within your body, or is it accessible by request or subpoena?
In our case, that would be COPA who has that. COPA does their investigation. I'm not sure whether or not if the criminal side would have access to the COPA side. I don't know the answer to that one.
All right. Okay.
Any other questions?
Any question? In your tech market, in your structure, once a complaint has been made, can the person who makes the complaint withdraw it, or do they lose control of that? And that is a complaint which the group decides how it's going to handle and what it's going to do with, independent of what the person who originally brought it to you says they want or don't want.
Yeah, I don't know the specific answer whether or not they can withdraw, but I will tell you that there is some really, really high percentage of complaints that are made, and then when there's a follow-up, there's no additional communication. So it comes back as unfounded because they were not able to make contact again. And so some of those kind of things are some of the things that COPA, and I can certainly introduce you to the chief of COPA as well, but they've had to kind of deal with over the years, because what if somebody in the neighborhood does not want to go complain against I made the complaint because something happened to me, but my friend who was sitting right here, he doesn't want to get mixed up in it. So this is the place where we're trying to say now, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't compel the person to testify. And so, you know, there are a lot of ramifications of what happens in the community. We have on the COPA side, they have a really good team that goes out to the community, not just when there's been a police shooting, but kind of all the time, kind of talks about the role of COPA, the relationship that they want to have. So if they know of anything, and the police department in theory should be kind of doing the same thing. So I think that those lines of communication are very important. We certainly have seen that when COPA goes out to the community and a complaint is made, more often people do follow back up with it. But if it's just a call 411 to make a complaint, a lot of times it just kind of, it ends right there.
The reason I ask, and then I'll be quick, is that I run a system of discipline for lawyers as opposed to for police. And our rule is, once the complaint has been made, the complainant loses control, because we don't want them to be pressured to drop the complaint and to say, well, forget it, I'm not interested anymore. And so we say, once we know about it, we have to go investigate and determine whether it's valid or not. And the complainant can't come back and say, yeah, forget it, I changed my mind, I don't want to involve it.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that specifically from a COPA perspective.
We've got time for about one more before we open up our discussion relative to Columbus. Any other questions from the work group?
Good evening, Mr. Foreman. Quick question for you. You said that some of these cases can go on for years. So I'm interested to know what the delay is in coming to a resolution. And then how often do you all meet?
Yeah, I'm interested to know the reason why the delay too. I think it boils down to one, human error, which is why I'm suggesting make sure that you use technology, because human error is always going to come into play, right? You have an employee, and he got a desk full of complaints that he's never overseen, if there's no process to say, where's Geon's work, stuff is always going to fall through the cracks. I think second, I think it's important if we think of ourselves, if we think of the individuals, of the residents of the city as the customers, right? Don't you like it when Amazon tells you, hey, sorry, it's delayed. I told you I was going to have it today, but it's really not going to be there until Wednesday. To me, I think we need to boil this process down to the lowest common denominator. Let's speak the language that we all speak. Let's not make it lawyer speak. You know, I have to do stuff like what I did, all like in police board means like, man, what's the name of that Supreme Court rule? Oh, Garrity. I have to do stuff like that for real because this is not what I do for a living. We meet once a month for our executive session, and then once a month for our public session. Our public session is probably the only place that the public really truly gets to come to make complaints about the police department. And historically, it's been a place where you come and you complain, thank you, next speaker. Thank you, next speaker. And that was just kind of a continuous cycle. And it wasn't satisfying for them, for the members of the public. It wasn't satisfying us, the board. And so we put a new rule in place that the superintendent has to get back to us very specifically about the issues that were raised. We don't have to do it in a public meeting, but they definitely get back to us. This is what the conversation I had with Mr. Johnson about 1234 Main Street. This is what we're doing about it. So it creates some accountability. You know, there are times when we do have to meet more than once a month, depending on the complexity of a case. But that's typically, you know, I would say, let's talk time for a second. I know this isn't your question, but from the investigation takes however long it takes, and then we have a hearing, and that takes however long it takes. From a police board perspective, for me to watch the videos and review the transcripts, that per case, quite honestly, I'm probably going to say per case, that's probably 8 hours per case that I have to spend on one individual thing. And then every third Thursday of the month, I probably have from 4 in the evening to about 8 at night. So another 4 hours that month where we deal with specifically those things. Now, as the vice president and president, I certainly have other things I have to do kind of in between there. But, you know, and we're paid, I think, $1,000 a month. I think maybe about half of the board members turn down the pay. The other half take the pay. I take the pay. And so, you know, I think it creates a level of accountability. We have pastor on there, men and women, white, black, Latino, lawyers, ex-law enforcement. I do think as you're thinking through this, someone with law enforcement experience is very valuable because none of us have kind of been in the situations that they've been in. You don't necessarily want somebody so close to it that they only vote in favor of police, but it's oftentimes you have to kind of make sure that you're being fair, and not sometimes, all the time you have to make sure you're being fair. So you have to be able to view things from the perspective of the police officer as well.
All right, folks, we're going to, well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Foreman, for all of that. I think it's good to see someone who lives this in a practical way for the group to be able to ask you questions. And certainly thanks to our friends at Jones Day for setting this up. So we're going to move now into, you're certainly welcome to stay in for the remainder of the meeting. We're going to move into a discussion now around the Columbus model for the work group to kind of do some work. But again, thank you for being with us this afternoon. Thank
you very much. Right, I really appreciate the opportunity. And seriously, as you guys are putting this together or in the future after you have it together, let's be a resource for each other.
Thank you so much. We may take you fully up on all of that. Thanks a lot. All right, group, we're going to, so I want to make sure we allow you some time to process what you've heard. And today is really all about what powers and duties we really want to start to think about as it relates to the Office of the Inspector General here in Columbus. And so I guess I will open up for any clarifying questions that you have, certainly first and foremost. And then I wanted to think about, based on a lot of what Alexa ran through with us earlier in the meeting, you know, based on what you've heard, you know, what are the authority or key responsibilities we really want to make sure our Office of the Inspector General has here in Columbus? And so how do we make sure that the investigative body, as well as those who might be issuing discipline, or at least recommendations for discipline, are there particular responsibilities you've heard or authority that you've heard maybe in the other cities, or maybe based on what we heard in Chicago that you want to make sure we pick up on here as we build out this model? So floor is open for comments or questions around the Columbus aspect of this.
This is Jasmine. I think one of the things that I would like to be thoughtful about is making sure that our Office of the Inspector General and the Inspector General themselves are connected to the community. So I think it would make sense sort of either quarterly or monthly for them to host a community meeting as well, because I think it's important for those people to talk to their neighbors in this process as well.
Got it. Thank you, Jasmine. So this community connection piece, and I think you found that Chicago's model around that public meeting attractive for us to consider as well. Got it. Other thoughts?
I mean, the other thing that I would suggest, and listening to him, is that there should be some timelines by which this investigation should proceed. I mean, if a complaint is filed, it should be a response due within a certain time parameter. There should be a certain time limitation with respect to the investigation. There should be a certain time period within which a decision is reached following the close of the investigation. Now, they can always be modified, but unless you have some kind of guidance, these things can go on indefinitely, and individuals may become discouraged, not only in continuing with the process, but in participating in the process at all.
Got it. Make sure there's established timelines for all the elements. You didn't say this, but I think certainly the point that got made earlier is that there's communication with the person making the complaint throughout that process. I think is the other really important aspect that we heard from Mr. Foreman. Other thoughts?
Yeah, this is Kyle Strickland. I would just add as a +1 to Fred's point of that timeline piece, and if there's any way we could do some research into kind of, you know, what some of those average timelines look like from start to finish, and whether there's a maximum, minimum timeline, that I think would be helpful.
I also think the multiple interviews and the calls that he expressed that happened when he was going through the process could be problematic. So looking at the complaint process and the investigation process and trying to reduce as possible the number of times a complainant may be interviewed by an investigator, to sort of streamline that, so you're not getting, like I said, those 4 phone calls within 2 weeks repeating much of the same information.
Got it. Okay.
Hey, Mo.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's Anthony. Hey, I think the contract stipulates timelines on investigations, if I'm not mistaken. I do know from working in IA, we had so many days to complete an investigation. I do like the fact of following up with people during the course of an investigation, because I do not believe that, at least in my tenure at CPD and IA, we did not do that. But I think the contract does speak to timelines on internal investigations.
Got it. And if I'm understanding, though, Anthony, in this case, what we'd be talking about is a whole separate timeline, right? Because they would have to then finish their investigation, at least in part, and then our process might pick up from there. So it's almost an additional timeline. Is that your understanding as well?
So it's tricky. It's all going to be dependent upon how we set it up. If ours has its own investigative group, then
Right.
there may be a totally separate timeline. But if you're using the current internal affairs investigators to do it, then they may, a lot of that's going to depend on the contract too, obviously. If they have to finish theirs within that 56 days or however many days, and then it's coming over to the CRB or the IG, I mean, there may be an additional timeline which would make it longer.
Right. So just look, part of the problem that we face is this: everybody looks at their process as an independent process. And so if you got three independent processes trying to come together as one, like Voltron, it's not going to work. It got to be one process. It could be your process within this big process, but that it has to be critical. Otherwise, it starts to, you know how when one person tells somebody a story, you go all around the room, you got a whole different story. It has to be one process. And so, like, I have been recommending Six Sigma, right? Just kind of saying, if GE can figure out how to not make any mistakes in making light bulbs, certainly we can figure out how to not make mistakes, in this kind of process. So I'll just kind of share that.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir.
The echo
Other
the
thoughts?
design thing, like from the user end, like how can we make this the most user-friendly process, the most efficient process? Like, I definitely think there are some corporations in Columbus that would love to lend their time and talents to support the people of Columbus in this endeavor.
Got it. So I just threw back up Alexa's presentation just for the sake of jogging your memory. And there's about, I think about 3 slides here around the general duties and powers that she found as she kind of scanned the landscape across the country. I just throw these up as really just reminders of any particular aspects that are really resonating with you. I mean, part of what we're trying to do is to make sure we understand the scope of both the CRB itself as well as the Inspector General, and if there are any limitations on either of those roles would also be appropriate for conversation. So I just kind of put this up here as a reminder of some of the things that she shared, and then we'll obviously make this available after the meeting as well if you have thoughts around additional aspects you want to take a look at. But anything here that's resonating with you or that gives you pause, certainly we want to get those comments on the record.
One of the functions that happens that I found particularly interesting is the role at reviewing systemic issues and bringing those to light, or trends in particular types of infractions that are requiring discipline.
Yeah. And so I see, we looked at like the New York model, for example. We had the CRB equivalent was really looking at individual officer conduct and the appropriateness of sanctions at that level. And then we had the Inspector General really looking at patterns of complaints and looking at system level issues. How do we feel about that kind of separation of duties as it relates to Columbus, that the CRB is looking at more individual incidents and investigation of those, and then the IG's office looking much more systemically if we are going to have kind of two, I'm going to say, independent organisms kind of working together? How does that structure strike you as appropriate or not for our city?
I like that sort of model. I also think that the sort of long-term, last time we talked about like having an actual policy position, and or maybe now it sounds like part of an office that does policy. So maybe there is a policy office within the Inspector General office that also investigates sort of long-term patterns of practices, but can lend a hand to the board if there are some sort of immediate individual officer involved things, because I don't want to leave the board hanging with no resources to sort of have investigatory power. Yep.
Yeah, so this idea of making sure that within the Inspector General there is a person or set of people whose responsibility is to look at policy in the broader context of what needs to change, maybe with the contract, with the general city rules, those kind of things, as well as having the investigative function over the CRB. I think I heard you on that. Any other comments around duties, powers, authority you would want to see within the Columbus Inspector General?
A question for Geon. Are there any diversity requirements for the Office of the Inspector General, or sort of your board, or just, you know, how do you make sure that you don't end up with a whole bunch of brown people on the board and then a whole bunch of white people in the Inspector General's office?
Yeah, so you know, I mean, I think it's like any other government. You have rules about diversity and all that kind of thing, and so I think that some of that happens. I don't know if it's done intentionally, but ours is pretty diverse. Both the police board, COPA, and the Inspector General as well. All of the offices that I can think of, they're all pretty diverse. Now, I don't know if that was done intentionally or if it kind of just happened. We had to come up with a criteria for police board members as a part of our the consent decree. And so I suspect others may have had to come up with some similar kind of rules, but that I don't know. I mean, and I know for sure we did have some very specific conversation about law enforcement, right? Former law enforcement. I know COPA kind of had that as well. One suggestion, I was actually just writing an email to you guys, something that that I think would be a really good idea is talk to either our federal monitor or a federal monitor in another city someplace. When we interviewed Superintendent Brown for the superintendent position here, he said that he, although he never worked under a consent decree before, he actually reached out to another place that imposed the consent decree and kind of started putting some of those things in place for himself. So it's kind of an easy way to get to some of the things that you need to do. And I think that some of the hiring things is a part of it.
Any other questions, comments around the general powers of the Office of the Inspector General?
This is more a direct question about Chicago and how they do it. And I guess I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, that their COPA handles most of the investigation that's then presented to your police board for sort of review and recommendation on discipline.
Yeah, so two different things. So I know it's all breaking a rule, but one is an internal rule, like maybe you were late for work or, you know, insubordination. Another one is something dealing with a member of the public. So it could be bad language, it could be stealing, it could be excessive force, right? So they do COPA would do the investigation as if it relates to a member of the public. They would do the investigation. They present that then to CPD. Here's our recommendation. The superintendent can agree with the recommendation, disagree with the recommendation. If they disagree, we're the tiebreaker. That case then comes to the police board and there's a hearing. So the superintendent will have his lawyer doing one side of the case. The police officer will defend himself on the other side of the case. And then we're like the judge. We're like the judge and the jury, I guess you could say. Does that make sense, Aaron? Did I do that right?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Other questions or thoughts? So the second question really is, you know, are there other things we didn't talk about that in your vision for an effective CRB and then complemented by this Inspector General, are there other responsibilities you were hoping to hear about as a part of the responsibility that you didn't, that you want to put on the agenda for consideration as well? Any of those thoughts?
One thing I'd like to see that's not necessarily a role of the board, but would love to see the tracking of this. So, you know, do we tend to see that there are more incidents that happen on one side of town with, you know, certain, I don't know, precincts, if you will, for the police officers. It would be nice to know, where are we seeing these complaints? Is there a trend? And how then do we mitigate some of what's happening, right? Then does that become some more community policing, all of that sort of stuff? So I just would like to be able to track trends, behavior, so that we see if it impacts the community sentiment and safety and security.
A great point. Alexa, I'm going to ask you, in your research, is that function mostly on the IG side of this equation based on the models you looked at? And also, are there any public disclosure of like trend data or any of that kind of thing that you saw in your research?
Yes, it usually is in the Inspector General's office. Sometimes it would be in their annual report where they'll analyze the different trends and it'll be released to the public.
Got it.
If you look in Chicago at our Inspector General of Public Safety, you can get all of that kind of information, and it's very telling. Now, there's correlation and there's causation, so I don't know that you can necessarily make a determination about if something was right or wrong, but some of the access to the data, it's very incredible. And I'll give you one that's been here, I'm assuming there, you have an issue with young Black men and the police. Well, if you look at our data, it's something like over 50% of Black male police officers are at retirement age. So if you think that you're over policed today, tomorrow you have a much bigger problem. But having access to data like this are some of the things that you can now try to make different kinds of decisions based on the data that you have.
Very good. Very
Hey,
good.
Mo, on the additional things, I think it's important for the IG to be able to have access to the early warning system to identify those officers that have a pattern of complaints and potentially excessive use of force. Those usually go to the supervisor to have a conversation with the officer about those excessive complaints. That probably needs to go to the IG's office.
Okay. And they can start to look at patterns if patterns exist within that data. Makes sense. Okay, very good. So one of the things, any other comments around just the general powers and duties before we move to the second piece?
If I could just add one more thing, I know I'm talking a lot.
Yeah.
At the same time, while you guys are looking to make sure that the process is improved and police accountability and all that, make sure that something about wellness for police officers is in here too, right? Because again, if you'll be disciplining police officers and they have one perspective on it, it has an impact on a lot of other police officers of what happens. And so if you want a healthy police force, I think it's also important that you look at that side of things too. You're going to see drinking problems, you're going to see drug problems, you're going to see family problems. And it's people's lives, and it's going to have some other domino effects. So I would also make sure that whatever that mental health process is, that you guys take that into consideration too.
Okay. All right, so we want to continue this conversation. One of the things you saw were a number of models in terms of how the IG complaint process actually picks up, because there's a lot of models from that. And so I guess I'll just ask generally, any early thoughts around how you see the collaboration between the IG and the CRB happening? Are there certain connection points you want to have? And Jasmine mentioned one around some of the policy pieces already, but there are other collaborations you would certainly want us to make sure we thought about as we think about the independent roles of both the Inspector General and the Civilian Review Board. Any thoughts around collaboration or points of synergy we need to keep in mind?
I would like for the Office of the Inspector General to be on some sort of regular report schedule with the Civilian Review Board. I sort of see them as sort of a function of the Civilian Review Board. I guess they're their own entity, but technically they're there to serve the people, right? The police have their investigations internally. This is the investigations on the side of the people. And so I think that they should be responsive to sort of the needs of the board.
And I imagine you would want, you know, some kind of live presentation at certain intervals, but then also at least an annual report. Is that what I hear you saying, Jasmine?
Yeah, I mean, and like at least like monthly briefings with emails, like something
Right.
on a fairly consistent basis that keeps everybody in the loop.
I'm with you. Okay.
One of the things that I found surprising in that discussion was that it appeared as though the Inspector General and the review board had concurrent jurisdiction, that they each could have jurisdiction over the same matters. If that's right, you got to have some way of figuring out who's doing what.
Noted. Got it. Okay.
Hey, Mo, this is Matt. If President Foreman is still on, and maybe we could ask him how the CPB and COPA either work together or don't work together. I believe in a previous conversation I had that they have to the roles of the board itself, they couldn't be involved in the investigations that COPA did. So if President Foreman's still on, maybe we could ask him that real quick. Sorry.
Sure. So there's definitely mutual respect. I've seen it go a couple of different ways, right? I've seen it where the head of COPA just agrees 100% with what the superintendent says. Doesn't really seem too independent, right? They never disagree with anything. So, and I've seen other cases where the superintendent disagrees with everything that COPA says, right? And so I think the point is to have some kind of balance to make sure that they are meeting on a regular basis. Where I've seen it work most successfully is when they just have a standing meeting. So when they have something to disagree about, they've been meeting on a regular basis anyway. It's not a I got you kind of thing, and the superintendent is backing his people. It's a mutual respect for improving the process. I do know that they do have some dependencies upon each other in terms of getting information from each other and that kind of thing. And again, as human effort, as human nature comes in, that's where a lot of the breakdown occurs. And so again, sometimes if there's some kind of use of technology that makes that process better or faster, easier, I would strongly encourage that. But you can't, it's been a monumental change, like truly monumental for us to have bi-weekly meetings and quarterly meetings, just because it's like we're all on the same page. There are some things I can't share with COPA or CPD. There's some things they can't share with me. We all know where those boundaries are, and we hold to those boundaries.
Very good. All right, the last thing around this I did want to get some thoughts about is in terms of how we want to seek these individuals and any qualifications that really need to be. I think Alexa did a good job of kind of giving us a summary of what some of those more educational background things are we can build on. But just from your vantage point, when you think about this role of Inspector General, who I think, as Jasmine articulated, really is kind of the people's advocate in a lot of ways, making sure that there's fairness here. Are there qualifications or attributes you really want to make sure you get on record for in terms of how we would go about selecting that person, regardless of the process, that you really want to see in that role as it relates to Inspector General? So any qualifications, attributes, skill set, any of those things that you would think are critical to that role. I think what we heard was a hybrid of folks who had community connection, community credibility, but weren't necessarily law enforcement and didn't necessarily, but knew how to run an agency or department and were more managers than they were investigators. And so thoughts about that and any of the skill set we'd be looking for in our Inspector General.
start. I do think some level of experience with investigations is important, especially if they're going to be evaluating the investigators underneath them as part of their agency managerial duties.
And Aaron, what would that look like for you in terms of, is that law enforcement experience or, investigation in another forum? What does that experience maybe look like for you?
I think in some of the slides earlier, there was descriptions about experience either with law or sort of other types of investigations. It didn't necessarily say law enforcement investigatory experience.
Okay. Thoughts about that? Is that something we want to keep as a subtle criteria at this point in terms of having investigative experience? Or are you looking for a different type of leader in this role?
Hey, Mo, I like the investigative experience, but I think they've also got to be familiar with the contract. Also got to be familiar with Garrity and Weingarten. When you talk about investigations and interviewing police officers, definitely have to be well versed on those laws.
And you see that as a function of the leader of this department, not just having that capacity within the department.
Yeah,
that's important for the leader.
I think it's very important.
Okay. Other perspectives?
They need to have some background in criminal law, because that you're going to be evaluating allegations of where a question may become as to whether or not there was a reasonable, articulable suspicion, probable cause, consent. You have a whole host of issues that could develop during the course of this process. So certainly someone have to be versed in those areas as well.
And Fred, are you thinking that, again, within the department, or are you saying within the role that the leadership needs to have that experience?
I'm actually suggesting both.
Okay. All right. Make sure I was hearing you. Very good. Any other thoughts about the criteria, the qualifications of the Inspector General role?
I'd like to see somebody who has some experience managing something. I think it's risky to have somebody who has lots of subject matter knowledge, but has not had the experience of trying to manage any kind of enterprise.
I had trouble hearing him.
Yeah, I was about to say, you're breaking up a little bit, Ken. We couldn't hear exactly the experience in what area again?
In managing something, managing anything.
Oh, managing. Got it. So you want to see some management experience, having led people and processes, I'm assuming.
Exactly.
Well, I'm going to also ask.
Has only subject matter knowledge.
Who was that?
Sorry, this is Asleen. Mo, I was going to say, is it possible to also take some of what we received at the beginning of this meeting and process it? Because it'd be nice to look at some of the other things that cities were doing, and then we can get back to you. Because I'd like to process that a little bit more to make sure, I have a full thought around this.
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of your early thinking, but this is not closed, as you know. So at any point at subsequent meetings, the idea is that you would bring back anything. Hey, I took a look at this and I think differently, or this is my thought now about it. Absolutely appropriate. Please do that. So I would encourage all of you to do the exact same thing. Was somebody else trying to get in there as well? Make a comment? Okay. And then the other part of this was in terms of the initial seating of this individual, this would in essence be a leader of a city department, to loosely put it. Whose role, or how would we go about both seating the initial Inspector General as well as subsequent to that, when there's a vacancy, what role? I think you heard a couple of models Alexa kind of went through earlier. I know I recall one was, a prioritized list, or at least a list of 3 recommendations to the mayor who made the appointment. are there thoughts about how this person gets seated from the group at this point?
Are there guidelines to what the charter amendment would suggest we should look at?
Matt or Kate, you guys are probably more familiar than I don't think it's that specific, but I could be wrong. Thoughts about the charter amendment give any guidance around seating of the role?
Mo, I can speak to that if Matt and Kate don't mind. Yes, the Inspector General is appointed by a 2/3 vote of the CRB and then confirmed by the mayor, according to the charter.
In the amendment. Okay, very good. So that is already codified then. So that makes sense. Okay, very good. Let's move into our last piece of the agenda, which is kind of additional things from the work group, other topics that you want to bring forward, or any reflections from, between last meeting and this one. Now would be certainly the time to raise any of those issues, thoughts, or ideas. All right, I don't see any going once, twice. All right, I guess there's no additional thoughts today. I'm going to get ready to move toward closing then. We've got a few minutes. Matt, I'll come to you for just kind of an overview of our our next meeting schedule, which I'll throw that up on the screen here in a second in terms of the date. You should already have that one. And then also we will be kind of recapping what we heard at this meeting, sharing it back in meeting form as we always do. But again, as was suggested, please be thoughtful about the documents and things that are coming forward. Everything will be put back onto the site as well as emailed to you. I certainly want you to continue to take a look at those items as they become available and bring back any good thinking around that. Matt, you want to talk about the next meeting?
Thanks, Mo. Yeah, we're looking at tentatively right now. Members will get something definitely. September 16th, that is a Wednesday. And we are looking at devoting the entire meeting to bargaining, looking at the contract we have with the FOP, asking Baker Hostetler and our attorney's office to provide some information on how we negotiate with the police union.
So Matt, is that date correct? I have a different date, but I want to make sure we didn't switch something without me knowing. I had to. It is the 16th. I had the 22nd. I believe.
I believe we looked at the. I thought we said the 16th, but I'll double check that, Mel. We'll make sure all the members know. Plenty of time.
All right, very good. Sounds good. Again, just a reminder, if you want to screenshot this, or you probably should already have it, but all of the information from the meetings are being posted on the city website that's referenced on the slide here, so you can always get the presentation, any of the content we've shared in the meeting that will be available there, as well as in your email for work group members as well. And then we'll get this date clarified, so don't focus on that one just yet. I want to make sure we are on the same page there. We had a different date from our earlier conversation. Any closing thoughts, comments from the work group or any of our guests that are still on? All good? All right, I'm gonna let you guys go get some sleep then. I will see you all in a few weeks, and we will pick up the conversation around the collective bargaining agreement and looking at some aspects therein. Again, up on the screen, you have Matt and Kate's information if you need to follow up in between meetings. And with that, we'll get ready to close for today. We'll see you again in a couple weeks. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.